I had just moved back in with my dad after a long breakup and a failed job stint in another city. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I needed a reset. The house felt different not just because I had been gone but because of her. My dad's new wife, my stepmom, had a way of filling every space without trying. She was confident, always collected, and way younger than I expected. Maybe 10 years older than me, if that. Tall, poised, always walking around barefoot like she owned the floor beneath her. I didn't think much of it at first. She was nice, made dinner most nights, and tried hard to make the house feel like home. We didn't talk much, but when we did, she had this calm way of speaking that made me forget I was supposed to keep my guard up. I noticed things. The way she leaned over the counter when she talked. How she looked at you a second longer than needed. She'd catch me glancing sometimes, but never said a word. My dad traveled a lot, always had. He called from hotels more than he came home. She never complained, but the silence between her and the front door said enough. She had wine at dinner alone more nights than not. I guess that's how people start slipping, slowly without knowing they're falling. It happened on a cold evening when the power cut out. Storm outside, pitch black inside. I was in the bathtub soaking. I liked quiet nights like that. No phone, no noise. Just heat and silence. Then I heard her voice through the door, soft and unsure, asking if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She opened the door anyway, holding a candle. The light flickered against the walls, and for a second, I thought maybe she'd leave it and go. She didn't. She stepped in barefoot, eyes calm. She placed the candle on the counter and leaned against the sink. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept in days. Then she laughed, light but a little sad, and said, "Crazy night, huh?" He nodded. I didn't move. I was submerged up to my chest. She stared at the water, then at me. There was a pause, one that felt too long. Then, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she slid her robe off her shoulders and stepped into the tub. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. The water shifted around us, warm and heavy. She didn't touch me. She didn't say a word. She just leaned back, closed her eyes, and breathed. My heart was racing. I didn't know if I should get out, scream, or stay still. Chose the last. She turned her head slowly and opened one eye. "You don't have to be nervous," she said, almost in a whisper. I wasn't sure what I was feeling, but I knew everything had just changed. The water was still, but everything in me wasn't. I could feel her thigh barely grazing mine under the surface, and even that slight contact felt like fire. She looked so calm, like this was normal. Like two people sharing a bathtub without a word was just fine. I wanted to ask her why she was doing this, but my mouth wouldn't cooperate. She tilted her head back, eyes on the ceiling. Then she spoke quietly. "He doesn't look at me anymore. You know that." Her voice didn't shake, but there was something hollow in it. I could walk around this house naked, and he'd ask me where his keys are. I didn't know what to say. My throat was dry. She kept talking. "I married him thinking I'd have someone who saw me, not just lived with me." Her hand moved slightly in the water, sending little ripples across the surface. I swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," was all I could say. She laughed under her breath, but there was no humor in it. "Not your fault. You just actually see me, don't you?" I didn't answer, but we both knew the truth. She must have noticed all the times I looked, the silence in the hallway when we passed each other, the lingering seconds where nothing happened but everything was felt. "I shouldn't be here," she murmured, but she didn't move. Her fingers brushed against mine this time, soft and quick, like she was testing something. I didn't pull away. That small touch was enough to send a rush of confusion straight through me. Felt guilt, sure, but I also felt alive. And maybe that's what scared me the most. She was my dad's wife. That fact sat in the back of my mind like a warning siren, but I couldn't bring myself to leave the water. She turned her head toward me again. "You're not a kid anymore." Her voice was quiet, careful, but intentional. "You know what this is, right?" I nodded without thinking. I didn't want to pretend. I didn't want to lie. I wanted her to keep talking even if it wrecked me. The bath wasn't about water anymore. It was a space that shouldn't exist. Too quiet, too close, too real. Every second stretched. Every breath between us was loud. I kept telling myself I should get out, wrap a towel around myself, leave. But I didn't. Couldn't. I wasn't sure if it was weakness or want. She sat up slowly, water trailing down her arms. "This was a bad idea," she whispered. She stood, graceful and unbothered, grabbing her robe. I stared straight ahead, pretending I didn't see her. But I did. Every detail. Every movement. She stepped out and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she paused and glanced back at me. "You won't say anything, right?" she asked. I nodded again. She gave a small smile and left the door slightly open. And just like that, I was alone again. Except everything had changed, and nothing felt quiet anymore. I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. The way she looked at me before leaving the bathroom, like she was asking a question without using words. I kept replaying it over and over. The silence. The water. Her voice. It was too much and not enough. I stared at the ceiling for hours until the darkness in my room felt heavier than my thoughts. I got up, didn't even know why. I moved without thinking, like my body was acting on something I wasn't ready to admit. I found her downstairs. She was at the counter, barefoot, wearing one of my old hoodies. Her hair was tied up, no makeup, just sipping wine like nothing was out of place. She looked up at me and smiled, small and quiet. No guilt, no shame. Just a strange calm that made everything feel even more dangerous. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. I sat down near her, heart pounding but face blank. She poured another glass, slid it toward me. We drank in silence for a few minutes. Then she laughed lightly. "You always walk like the floor's going to break under you." I blinked, caught off guard. "What?" She smiled. "Careful. Like you're afraid to be here." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. "Maybe I am." She looked down at her glass. "Me too." Something shifted in that moment. Not loud or dramatic. Just a crack in the wall between us. She reached out and touched my hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. My pulse was loud in my ears. She didn't let go. "I keep telling myself to stop. But when I look at you, I don't want to." My throat tightened. I wasn't prepared for this to be real. I thought maybe it was a one-time thing, some weird accident of emotion and timing. But this was something else. This was choice. I leaned in before I could talk myself out of it. Our lips met softly at first, like we were both testing whether it should happen. Then it deepened, slow, deliberate, like we were making up for all the hesitation that came before. She didn't pull away. I didn't want her to. Her hands found my face, my shoulders. My mind was screaming, but my body wasn't listening. Everything after that blurred. All I knew was her breath, her skin, her warmth. I wasn't thinking about my dad, or the lines we were crossing, or what came next. Just her. Just this moment that felt wrong in every way but one. It finally made the silence stop. When it ended, neither of us spoke. She rested her head on my shoulder, fingers still laced in mine. I didn't move. Couldn't. I didn't want to break whatever fragile space we were in. I knew what we did couldn't be undone. And yet, a small part of me didn't care. I should have felt ashamed, disgusted, even afraid. But all I felt was her, and the way everything finally made a kind of terrible, beautiful sense. The next morning was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. I could hear her moving around the kitchen like nothing had happened, like the night before hadn't ripped something open. I stayed in my room longer than usual, hoping the silence would bury everything, but it didn't. Finally went downstairs. She looked at me once, briefly, then back to the coffee machine. No words. Just routine. Later that day my dad came home. He walked in with a duffel bag and the same tired smile he always wore. He hugged her, kissed her cheek, joked about missing dinner again. She laughed like she always did. Like nothing in her world had shifted. Watching it felt surreal. I stood there, nodding when spoken to, pretending. but it was like being on the outside of my own life. I couldn't even look at him without flinching. At dinner, she passed him the salt and asked about his meetings. He went on about traffic, deadlines, hotel food. I watched her nod, smile, play her role. Then she glanced at me, just once, for half a second. There was nothing in her expression, but the moment sat heavy in my chest. Could barely eat. I felt sick, not just from guilt but from how easily she moved through it. Like last night was a switch she could turn off. Couldn't. After he went to bed, I was heading to my room when I saw her standing in the hallway, arms crossed. We stood there a few feet apart, both quiet. Then she spoke. "We never talk about it. Not ever." Her voice was low, not harsh but final. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't make it worse. She took a slow breath. "It was a mistake. It can't happen again." He nodded. She stepped past me, her shoulder brushing mine slightly, almost too light to notice. That night I didn't sleep either. Everything felt heavier than it had before. It wasn't just about what we did. It was what it meant. I'd broken something, and it wasn't just between them. It was in me too. I kept thinking about the way she looked before she left the bathtub. How calm she seemed in the kitchen. The way she kissed me like she needed it just to breathe. Was any of it real? Or just a reaction to feeling invisible? The worst part was, I didn't hate her for it. I didn't even blame her. We were both lonely. Both wanted to feel wanted. It wasn't love. I don't think it ever was. But it wasn't nothing either. And maybe that's what messed me up the most. Weeks passed. We avoided being alone. Conversations became short, casual. She still smiled when my dad was around. I still played the part of the respectful son. But the silence between us had weight now. I could still feel her, even in rooms she wasn't in. And I think she knew. I don't know what happens next. Maybe nothing. Maybe everything. But one thing's for sure. What happened in that bathtub didn't stay there.